Welcome to Occult of Personality, esoteric podcast extraordinaire at occultofpersonality.net. I'm your host, Greg Kaminsky. Occult of Personality podcast is available on iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher Radio, Acast, TuneIn, and all the best podcast apps. This is episode number 184, featuring an interview with publisher, scholar, and writer Mogg Morgan. Occult of Personality podcast is made possible by you, the listeners, and by the subscribers to the Chamber of Reflection at chamberofreflection.com, the newly redesigned Occult of Personality membership section, as well as all of our patrons who participate via the Occult of Personality Patreon campaign at www.patreon.com/occultofpersonality. And I'd also like to give a shout out to the Brethren of Coastal Lodge number 57 in Connecticut. Occult of Personality podcast is also sponsored by Miskatonic Books, an online store that focuses on the esoteric, occult, ceremonial magic, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, witchcraft, the Golden Dawn, as well as dark fantasy, classic horror, and supernatural fiction. They carry books by all your favorite esoteric publishers as well. Just visit miskatonicbooks.com. Temple of Thelema is a true outer order of the greater mysteries, providing ceremonial initiation, structured training, and regular group work, all in conformity with the principles of the Book of the Law. An investment of time, effort, and commitment is expected from each member. Each is expected to aspire fervently to the great work, to dare, with courage undaunted, to perfect that work, and ever to apply his or her best effort to effect harmony within the order and within the world in general. Founded in service to the AA, College of Thelema seeks to guide the student to an understanding of the law of Thelema. Most especially, this means a deeper understanding of oneself and of one's true will. A combination of instruction techniques is employed, including seminars, written texts, and individual work. For over 40 years, College of Thelema has published journals in the Continuum and Black Pearl, as well as several books on occult subjects maintaining high standards in Thelemic education. Visit Temple of Thelema at www.thelema.org. Anathema Publishing Limited. Quality occult books and contemporary esoterica. Established in 2011, Anathema Publishing aims to provide superior literature in content and form by creating a trinosophic relationship in troth and gabo between publisher, author, and reader. Anathema Publishing produces refined books for the true bibliophile on topics ranging from Gnosticism, traditional craft, alchemy, Hermeticism, witchcraft, to Luciferian theosophy. www.anathemapublishing.com. Now, in episode number 184, Mogg Morgan joins us to discuss independent publisher Mandrake of Oxford, as well as his recent books, Phi-Neter, Power of the Egyptian Gods, and Isis, Goddess of Egypt and India. Mogg Morgan is a publisher, writer, pagan practitioner, independent scholar, and theorist. He was Wellcome research student at Oxford, where his teacher was the late Professor B K Matilal, a widely respected expert on South Asian rational thought. He has published on both Indology and Egyptology. His books include Ayurveda, Medicine of the Gods, and Sexual Magick. More recently, Morgan has authored a sequence of books combining academic research with practical experimentation, beginning with Tankhem, Seth and Egyptian Magick, The Bull of Ombos, Seth and Egyptian Magick II, The Ritual Year in Ancient Egypt, Supernatural Assault in Ancient Egypt, Phi-Neter, Power of the Egyptian Gods, and Isis, Goddess of Egypt and India. I want to take a moment to praise Morgan's Isis, Goddess of Egypt and India. I particularly enjoyed this book. I think it's really well put together. The pictures that are included, the evidence that's covered, and the way it's laid out is particularly compelling, I think, and I'd like to see even more work along these lines from Morgan. Mogg Morgan, I want to welcome you to Occult to Personality podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So maybe before we begin, you might be able to give people who are listening a little bit of background or bio on yourself before we talk about some of your books.
You want me to blow my own trumpet?
For sure, yeah.
Well, I've been involved in, I guess, the occult world since the 1980s, really. Probably perhaps 1980, 1981, maybe a little bit before that. So that's quite a long time. I was born in Wales, but I have lived in Oxford for about 30 years now. I'm trying to think. I bought a copy of the Soft Tarot deck, and there was an address on that. It's a strange thing. You'd think on the Soft Tarot deck, I don't know, maybe you'd know this, that the address would take you through to the American OTO. But maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, I wrote to that address, but for some reason, I don't know, I got a letter back from someone in America, but who was in the Typhonian OTO. So you know, that seemed okay. Well, I didn't know any better, did I? You know, but it was okay. It worked for me for a while, and I'm still kind of involved in that Typhonian current, really, one way or another, although not necessarily with the same group of people. So I was interested in Aleister Crowley before I kind of tried to find his magical order. I sort of read the stuff as a young adult, really, and as lots of us do, and tried to practice that. Then I spent a certain amount of time, as I say, in the Typhonian order, and then I think if you read Kenneth Grant, his book Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, in particular, it turns you onto a particular current as well, which is, I suppose, broadly speaking, what you would call a tantric current. Well, you get that in Crowley as well. All these hints that there's like the two streams, really. There's the Egyptian magic is like quite one of the strong things, and then there's this tantric-y type stuff. So the two things together. So after that, I kind of there was somebody who used to be in the Typhonian order, which is Mike McGee or Lokanath, and he had his own got his own initiation really into with Dadaji and tantric stuff, and I was always interested in that. So I kind of went off and did that for a little while. And I'm still involved with that behind the scenes, I suppose. It's more of a kind of network more than anything. So there are those things, and I was quite involved in the kind of countercultural, political, occulty type scene back then. And none of our stuff the sort of stuff that everybody likes reading now, that we all read and you read and talk about and anything. It's difficult to imagine this, but 30 years ago, there was available, but it wasn't as available. And certainly stuff that I might have written, it would have been hard for me to persuade any publisher to do that, to take it on. It would have been, they wouldn't have wanted to do that sort of stuff, really. So it's just seemed an obvious thing. And the same with the artwork. I knew quite a few artists and people doing all sorts of weird stuff, and people doing Earth Mysteries things, and it was very unfashionable, really. As Crowley was, in a way, if you think about back then, an awful lot of Crowley was not available. It was only available in kind of what you would call samizdat editions, photocopies and cheap editions. So apart from the big sellers, the perennial big sellers, most of the sort of interesting little things, none of that was available. So it seemed it was an obvious door to try, an invitation to get involved with publishing our own stuff. Nobody else was going to do it, so may as well have a go.
Right.
So that's my three things really. The kind of as a practitioner, but also as an author, wannabe author, an investigator, and as a publisher. I do a lot of publishing under that. The badge of Mandrake, really, as a sort of homage to the Crowley's company that existed from back then. So that's enough, isn't it? That's enough. More than enough, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, for people who may not know you by name, they probably know Mandrake of Oxford.
Do you think so? That's very kind of you to say.
I don't know. Maybe it's such an insider thing. I just assume it, but I'm betting that most people listening to this have heard of your books.
Well, if I totaled it up, we have sold a lot of books. I mean, at first, it wasn't very many. If we did the fanzine, and maybe it would be about 100 copies or something like that of a fanzine. But now, it's excuse me, it's hundreds of thousands of books now all over the place. So, I mean, the thing, the big breakthrough in terms of publishing, but also magically for me, was meeting Jan Fries. And again, that was it's funny, he did this little book called Visual Magick, which is, still a classic, really. It's still a bestseller, but it was a kind of, it was a little essay, a little sort of handwritten essay bumping around the kind of Martian network and the occult scene, really. It wasn't in print or anything. And I thought, well, we needed something to do. And there were a lot of hippies in Oxford who had got all this equipment that they had access to. So we had the possibility to do a kind of nice job. So I said, why not so I have a go with that. But it wasn't quite long enough to make a whole book. So I said, we could, as one would do at the time, and it's a kind of dodgy trick you do as an occultist publisher, is say, let's bung a bit of Austin Spare on the end of it, one of his essays or something. And he said, that's a kind of bad idea, really. But he says, I'm just going to write some more. I just sort of got some other stuff. And so he went away, and fair enough, he came back with, a whole book of ideas that people could use on visual magic, which is magic to do with the visionary sense and using sigils and art and making things and everything. And it's been a huge success, really, that book and the other ones that we've done. So, yeah, you're right. I think that those books and other authors, they are it's the authors, really. I always say that nobody ever heard of the publisher, really. It's not supposed to really be about the publisher, but obviously there's an aesthetic sense picking the stuff. It's supposed to be about the author.
Yeah, I can sympathize to some extent. I mean, nobody tunes into this podcast to hear me ramble on. It's the guests. It's the guests. So.
Oh, you sound like an interesting guy as well.
Oh, I wish I were. But you've published recently some really interesting material that I want to talk about, particularly topical now, Isis, goddess of Egypt and India.
Right.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about Why now? Why publish this book now? And the general implications of doing that.
Yeah. Okay. I've done lectures. I have to be really careful because there's so many. I could be talking for too long, really, because it does cover a lot of different themes, which I've been researching for a long time. It's as a set of ideas. I don't even remember. I can't quite remember how I first came across that idea. I studied Indology. Oriental Studies here at Oxford, and it may have been there or some other things, but obviously it's the kind of dream of sort of long dream of occultism, really, to find Indian or Isis in India. Mm-hmm. And it was a theosophical project because you got the whole book, whatever it is, I can't remember, it's either the Veil of Isis or Isis Unveiled.
Yeah, Isis Unveiled.
By Blavatsky. It changed its title, whichever one it is now. It started the other way round. It was either the Veil of Isis or Isis Unveiled, and so it was a kind of dream, really, to really connect the two cultures directly. And most people think that that's not been very successful in the past, or that the candidates are not. So, in a way, right, doing the book, I kind of think, well, it probably sounds like yet another balmy attempt to prove that ISIS exists in India, and that's inevitable. But as I say, it's always because these two threads are there within the occult tradition, the Egyptian one and the Indian one. They both have sets of ideas that are very important within the practice of modern magic and religion. People always want to connect the two and sort of move between the two, really. Anyway, but there is actually a certain amount of academic material written on this, which has been bumping around for ages, and I assembled that about. Well, I should say there was. It's obviously ISIS is obviously there in. Or there's a way of making ISIS there in terms of astrology, which is the Indian astrological system. But there's obviously no goddess in the whole of India that actually called directly Isis that I know of. Or there may well be. So she's going to have another name. So it's a question. Well, it's like Blavatsky would talk about the design of the Indian temples being very like pyramids and things like that. So it's going to be some sort of suggestion of it. So that's as far as I got. And then, somebody discovered or started theorizing, academics, about a particular temple in Kerala, a particular tradition. I should say that I've studied Indian temple quite a lot. I studied that at university, and most of the Indian temples that we really like, the very impressive ones that Blavatsky sort of has on the cover of a book, I think, in one stage, which are these kind of pyramidal structures, which are actually, well, sometimes you get a pyramid structure in the center of the temple, but the gate, they usually show the gateways of the temple with these enormous gopura structures, and suggest it. They are in a particular part of India, but the temple that people started paying attention to about 20 or 30 years ago, really, is actually in Kerala, and it's built in another style called Malayan style, really. And if you're interested in Indian architecture, in a way, it's not the most interesting. It's not the one that would immediately grab you. If you've got a book on Indian architecture, you'd look at it and you think, well, it doesn't look as good as, or whatever sort of Madurai or Khajuraho with all the erotic sculptures or whatever. It's really quite something. In a way, it looks. I mean, I'd ask people to sort of look at the pictures. It doesn't even look old. It looks remarkably like Roman architecture, in fact. which is a strange thing. It's these steeply gabled roofs with red pan tiles on them and quite a low structure. And when you just initially look at it, you think it doesn't look as it doesn't grab me really in some sort of way. And that's what happened to me. I ignored it for ages. But that is a kind of a clue, the fact that it has this Roman look to it. Partly because it's on that western coast of the south of India. You're going to have to look at a map to get this. It's the monsoon is very, very heavy. So you have to have those steeply pitched roofs and the tiling, otherwise the whole thing will wash away anyway and erode. So you have this particular temple called Golden Galur, which is in Cochin, really. And one of the first things that happened was that one of the Brahmins in the temple was commissioned, in the temple of Kali. He was commissioned to write a history of the temple, just as some local Brahmin who was clever enough to write a history. And usually it would be a kind of fairly standard history. It would have a bit of mythology and tell you about the cult status and everything like that. But he called his eventual book that was published, which hardly anybody has seen this, it is called The Secret Chamber, which is a weird title for a book about an Indian temple, to call it The Secret Chamber. And basically what he revealed was that underneath the temple is a secret chamber. And this is an incredibly unusual feature, or was thought to be, of Hindu temples, to have a secret chamber underneath them as kind of a crypt, whose purpose is unknown, but is very, very central to the structure of the temple, because all sorts of other things, even though it's invisible, they take account of it. So, for instance, when they have these elephant processions around the temple, instead of this herd of elephants, which are quite big, sort of circumambulating the temple and kind of in a complete circle, they go kind of all the way around, and then they change direction and they go back the other way, which is a bit, I suppose that's a bit like the churning, what they call the churning of the ocean of milk. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if you know this. When you go through the 108 mantras and then you get to the knot, or the whatever it is, the big bead in the center, and instead of going past it, you go back the other way, and so you're always churning back and forth. So people thought it was that. But then they thought, it's funny, the spot that they never walk over. In this book, it says that there's a passageway down there. There's a secret tunnel several hundred yards long. So, all right, so we've kind of got a mystery now of a secret chamber with a passageway under the temple leading from that runs east-west. So that is, that's very suggestive. And then you kind of look at the other features of the region, and one of the other amazing features, as I say, we're very close to the coast, is another very almost undiscovered element of India is its it's megalithic architecture. It has megalithic tombs, not Hindu tombs. They're megalithic tombs in that whole area. So one possibility is that the temple itself is built on top of a megalithic tomb, which again is, some of these things are difficult to confirm, right, for all sorts of reasons. It's not that easy to go poking around in a working Hindu temple. This is not a museum. This is still functioning, and the function of the temple is just, because of how long you've got, really. Any question you could ask is, if it's such a strange temple, do they have any strange liturgy in this temple? Is there any strange ritual practice? And you say, yes, it does. And then there's a whole lot of stuff about that. So I won't go into it too much. But anyway, so you've got a temple that has a secret chamber underneath it, and there's a passageway that's sealed off, but people know, and the passageway goes a certain place. So you've got an incredible mystery about this temple, and then you think, well, is there something unusual, apart from all these things are unusual, is there anything unusual about this district of India itself that would give it this, make the religion in that area a little bit unusual? And of course, lo and behold, this is the site. The temple is virtually built on the site of one of the lost cities of the ancient world, which is called Musiris. Musiris is an ancient port, basically, that's described in classical literature, by which people from the Middle East or from Egypt and Syria traded with South India. And they went, this is another part of the story that we had to kind of, that's had to be pieced together. So, instead of, you could think, well, look, you could probably get to India as we used to, right? Once upon a time, you could get to India on a kind of magic bus, and you kind of, you'd go wherever it was. You'd drive all the way across Europe on the magic bus, and you'd go through Turkey and Syria and Iran and Afghanistan and into the north of Pakistan. We've got a totally impossible journey now.
Right,
because
right.
It's just, you just wouldn't get any, it's just kind of, that in a way, in the ancient world, it was just as dangerous, or could be potentially as dangerous and tricky, even if you weren't going to be killed. It was expensive and long journey. So it'd be an obvious thing, is there a route across the open ocean? And there is a lot of trade routes that were not known about at all, that go from the Red Sea, which would be part of Egypt, across to the south of India. So there are all sorts of things and it takes 40 days. That journey would take you 40 days, which is a long journey in the ancient world. If you're thinking about Greek and Roman ships that normally dealt with the Mediterranean, for them to go to sea for 40 days and nights into the Indian Ocean, which is where there's a monsoon in full force, that's quite a feat of seamanship in its own right. But anyways, where eventually they land, basically, and cut the story a bit short, where they land is pretty much where the temple is. So there's a direct connection, if you like. There's a route, a journey that was plied, that was used in the ancient world between essentially Rome via its Egyptian colony to the south of India, where the Romans were sending gold one way, and in return for all the lovely things that they wanted, primarily, things, exotic animals for the amphitheater, but things like silk and textiles, but probably most of all, thinking of the area where this temple is, would be medicinal herbs, and primarily pepper, which the Romans were completely nuts about, as was everybody in the classical world at that time. And that is the area where it all comes from, all the best medicinal herbs and precious stones and jewels and all this kind of stuff. It all comes from that area, really. So it's a major trading area. So you've got this contact, you've got this conduit between essentially Egypt and the south of India, with no land, no need to go on the land in between, and there's evidence that the culture doesn't, and this trade has been going on a long time. So the question is there any indication that this temple might have had a different history? It's a temple of Kali and Shiva these days, but everybody knows that Indian religion has gone through a number of different changes over the years. So in the book, what I describe from other sources as well, from the folklore and from the liturgy that happens in, that basically the temple has a myth, an original myth that doesn't exist anywhere else in India. It's completely unusual, and this is, first of all, you've got the only goddess in the whole of the Indian tradition who wears a veil, and also the only goddess in the Hindu tradition who has a husband who is killed, murdered, and undergoes a triple death. She searches for him in a sort of in a kind of vengeful mood, if you like, or first in a kind of quite a anxious mood, but later in a vengeful mood, finds the dead body of her husband and brings him back to life. And that motif of the dying and resurrecting god, which doesn't exist anywhere else in India, with one possible exception. Everybody, all the academics, all the people who've researched this agree that the origin of that myth must be from the ancient Near East, probably from Egypt or Syria. And my book goes with the idea that it's the goddess, it's the mythology. Essentially, it's the mythology of the goddess Isis, plus her husband Osiris, and even the god Set, transferred to India in the early centuries, really, decades of the Common Era. That's in a nutshell.
Yeah,
right?
I think you make a
lot to take in.
It's a lot to take on board in a moment. But I think in the book you make a pretty convincing argument. And one of the pieces of evidence that I found compelling was you mentioned how Isis was seen as a protector of those who traveled by sea.
Yeah.
And this idea, which we've certainly, I think, is recognized, has been seen before in Egypt and west of Egypt into Europe, right? And so it makes sense that you might see this go into the East as well.
Right.
And you pointed out, I think, some of the iconography that survived, including the goddess figure in the ship.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Isis Pelagia.
Yeah.
Isis of the sea. Yeah, because people who navigate on ships, probably Greek navigators, I think the Romans kind of put all the money into this, but the actual people who navigated the things were Greek navigators. They've always kind of been cornered the market on that sort of stuff. But navigators, sailors, they tend to be superstitious. Maybe you shouldn't say superstitious. They tend to take notice of elemental forces and the power of the sea.
Yeah.
It'd be a foolish person who didn't respect the power of the sea. If you're going to spend 40 days and 40 nights trying to find your way across the ocean,
certainly.
Then of course, and the primary goddess of the Greek navigators was Isis, and there are all sorts of indications of that. In terms of the coins, and plus all the timings of these things as well. Even in the book I did it's in two parts. I kind of deal with the cult as it existed in Egypt at the time as well. I did quite a lot of research on that, and on the mystery tradition, because that is. We're talking about the mystery tradition surviving as well. It's not just the normal outer form of the cult of Isis. It's quite secret aspects of it.
That's a good point.
Events that happen. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, please.
Events that happen in Greece in March, when they're in the story, when they're kind of in the story of the Golden Ass. In fact, when the story there is coming to a climax, and that the person who's been transformed into the ass, the donkey, which is the former Set, they're going to be transformed back into reassume their human shape, and they have to do that by going to a nautical festival. They go to a festival in which the ships are being blessed before the beginning of the trading season, really, when they can start sailing, and that's exactly the time. So the ships set out that the festival in India also takes place exactly the same month, basically, when the navigation routes are opening and people are arriving from the Middle East. So there's all sorts of reasons to suspect that this is that there's something unusual happening in this place. for some of the reasons I've already said, and an awful lot more, including textual stuff. But yeah, the influence of the sea, and Isis as a goddess of the sea, which is, I don't know, there's a certain amount of discussion about whether the sea always had that function, or whether it was something that the Greeks kind of introduced into the cult of Isis, really. But essentially, I mean, if you look at the cult of Hathor, which is a kind of precursor of Isis, sea is also connected with the sea. Sea is often shown on boats and stuff. So,
yeah, I would imagine, from my, non-historical perspective, the goddess would have to be connected with salt water, with ships, with vessels, with safe passage from one place to another. I mean, all those things seem symbolic of the goddess.
Why do you say that? Can you say, I mean, that's
I think of it like an archetypal female ideas of, pregnancy and birth.
Right.
So you've got this idea of the vessel, the womb,
right.
The salt water, analogous to the fluid that the baby is washed out of the womb in.
Right.
This idea of passage from the other realm into the physical realm. So to me, that this is all symbolic of being the realm of the goddess, because it's all female symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's worth thinking about, really. It can be something else to unravel there. But I suppose rather naively, you think Egypt is, well, it's a culture that's kind of all along the River Nile. That's where you really initially. I mean, obviously, the Nile gives out into the Mediterranean at Alexandria, but in a way, you don't really associate the Egyptians in the earliest form with with long naval voyages, with long sea voyages. But then that isn't true either, because then you can immediately think, well, there's this legendary journey of Hatshepsut from the Red Sea, as you have to look on the map to Egypt, so that you've got the Nile, and then it's separated from by the eastern desert from the Red Sea. So that eastern desert that takes about 40 days, or 20. I think it's 25 days to travel from the Nile across the desert to the Red Sea port, even though that's a sort of well-organized road. But Hatshepsut's supposed to have done that and then sailed famously. So it's done a long time ago. It was about 1500 BC, I think.
Yeah. Well, I have a question too, because some of this evidence that I'm going to ask you about has been regarded as speculative, but you have people like Augustus Laplanjon or Ignatius Donnelly who try to point out, things like images of elephants in Mayan ruins and the presence of coca or cocaine in Egyptian tombs and things of this nature that suggest communication between these civilizations as we would regard them.
Right. Whether I don't know really. It just seems. I suppose even if you look at the reconstruction of the journey of Hatshepsut, it has to be said that the boat that they reconstructed didn't look like a very ocean-going vessel.
Right.
It had to keep quite close to the coast. I don't think it had a keel or anything. But yeah, I used to think about the South American thing. One of the things, having done the book, one of the comments I had that I hadn't really thought of is that given that there's this major trade wind basically between North Africa and South India. It's got a complex set of winds there. If I'm saying that Rome traded with South India, well, someone said, well, what about South Africa and South India? Because they'd have the advantage of the same trade winds.
Right.
And I thought you were going to say that in parts of, there's certain groups in I mean, I haven't really looked into this too much, but someone suggested it to me, and I thought, God, that sounds... Well, you know what it's like. You can, even though we're all a bit bonkers, but we always think that we're right and everybody else is bonkers. But and someone said, well, there's this piece of gold in South Africa, in one of the museums in South Africa, which is actually an Indian rhinoceros. It's a model of an Indian rhinoceros, and there's a difference between the Indian and the African rhinoceros in terms of, I think one's got 2 horns and one's got a single horn. So there's a big, I think I'm right, there's quite a clear distinction between the 2 species. And so why would someone, I mean, we're not talking about ancient history, we're talking about 600-700 years ago. But even so, it's not fully known that, so the people, given that Indian people, they really like gold, you see, when in the trade in stuff that we're talking about, they didn't really want anything much from us. From the West and the Mediterranean, apart from gold. They want just money, bullion, really. It's always the same. So and Indian culture, the Indian magic, everything, gold, it all revolves around gold, one way or another. Even the story of Patini in the temple we're talking about, gold is hugely important to the story. And of course in Egypt as well, gold is hugely important in that culture as well. So it's given that they have the wherewithal to travel in, we're talking about in India now, in 2,000 years ago. Again, people don't associate the Indians with as being an ocean-going culture, but they were. As they're discovering, as people read these stories in these ancient texts of the time of Christ, and they think, oh, it's just myth, you know, when they say all these people traveled by sea to get to some gathering. But
it's
it's probably true.
Yeah, it's very much so. I think.
If they can travel around that, all around that coast of India, they could travel across the ocean to the south of Africa.
Sure.
So, and again, you know, I don't know about this South America, what bits of that are true and what bits you know, about the cocaine and things like that. I do know that. I went to Portugal, very much on my mind tonight, Portugal. For a reason I can't think why. You go to Portugal and there was a plaque there, you know, Crowley was there and everything, but there was another, I got that plaque, I thought, but there's another plaque there about Vasco da Gama. And it says, oh, so-and-so was, you know, in Brazil, I guess. It was over in Brazil after the discovery of South America. And someone said, oh, the king had died. So he just got in his little boat, his little fishing boat, and sailed across from Portugal to Brazil just to give him the news. Yeah, I think it was sort of almost matter of fact. It's that once that... it seems like an enormous distance, an impossible connection to us, but it obviously was made. That journey was made in the ancient world, I would have thought, several times.
I think once they knew intellectually it was possible, boom, that was it. They could do it, even if it was difficult. You know, they were ready to endure the hardship because, well, once you're out there, you don't have a choice.
Right. No, absolutely. Like I say, it's not something I looked at. When I went to Portugal, I say I don't want to go. I'd love tangents, you know, but I was quite happy to go on a tangent. But there was a Portuguese anthropologist who did look at some of the languages of the lost tribes there, and this is always a difficult area. And there are certain words that are universal, and one of the words that is most common all over the world, that occurs in all sorts of different languages, is the word for the canoe, so the boat. So boats, and the name for a boat is, well, it's obvious, really. It's one of those things that, because the thing itself travels, the word travels with it, really. So obviously these things have been happening for a long time, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question, because this is a good point you raise. Certain unnamed authors have recently challenged magical practitioners and interested parties to cast their minds even further back in history or prehistory than ancient Egypt to sort of ground their magic, if you will. And I'm wondering, not necessarily what your thoughts are about that specifically, but what is your argument in favor of ancient Egypt as the sort of foundation stone of the Western tradition?
Well, it just is.
And I think, you make a good argument about that in the Phi-Neter, Power of the Egyptian Gods. So,
well, I guess you're talking about some of these techniques of magic that we use in the modern world are there, aren't they? They take us back to. I mean, the thing about Egypt is that it develops this sort of, it writes about magic and it develops this magical culture, and so it's a kind of, you can follow the train of thought back into the Stone Ages, if you like, into the sort of magic of the Stone Age, and some of its the oldest gods, including the god Set. The red god is a Stone Age god, basically, and once you get back to that sort of period, then you can go back as you're there, right? You go right back as far as records go. So I kind of think that is a reasonable way of looking at things. And also, what do you think is the origin of religion in itself? I mean, have you got a theory about how does magic, or how does religion? I should say, in Egypt, you don't really have a word for religion. You have a word for magic. But religion is a very, very useful term. I know that, but it kind of comes along later. But so I'm going to use it for convenience. But what we call magic, or the magical religion, that kind of thing, how does it get going? I'd sort of put to you that there are kind of two basic kind of themes. There's the kind of idea of shamanism, some sort of ecstatic trance technique, and then there's the stuff to do with the dead, with the communication, or certainly the first beginnings of religion may well have taken place beside the corpse of a dead relative, basically. The kind of things that people, I mean, even the goddess Isis that we're talking about, she originally is a funeral goddess. I mean, not even a goddess. She's a kind of bird. She's a bird of, along with her sister Nephthys, the two kites. They're two raptors, basically, that appear whenever there are corpses around, whenever there's a funeral, and they make a noise, right? They make in fact, the noise that people make at funerals is probably related to the things that birds did naturally. They probably imitate that. So there's a kind of natural development from stuff done with in the process of burying someone a departed ancestor, a departed relative, and the whole kind of practice of magic, really, one way or another. So one of the things I'd sort of traced with an earlier book is, see, in the modern world, we like to do this sort of liturgy thing, the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. The practice of the Eucharist, if you're a Christian, you call it Eucharist, the sort of kind of sabbatic meal of some sort, the eating of the bread and the drinking of the wine, which is a very pleasing and a very powerful religious technique, but also I'd say it's a very powerful magical technique, really. An awful lot of vast amount of magic, certainly in Egypt and I think elsewhere, is very much tied up with eating and drinking. Eating magic and drinking magic, sort of that's the important way that we kind of transform things and you can think of all sorts of connections with that, with alchemy and with sexual magic as well. So even within the Thelemic cult, they have their Eucharist, which is is the bread and the wine, but really it's got sexual fluids or incorporated into the Eucharist. So in a sense, you're practicing a kind of cannibalism. It's a sort of very much reserved, but you're eating human flesh, aren't you?
Yeah, well, this raises a question I feel compelled to ask, because there are those among the listeners who are going to be more literalists, and many times we have a sort of a correlation in our minds between more literal interpretation of things and a more less advanced technological society. Although I feel often this is in error, but nevertheless, the question would be: is this Eucharist symbolic of something that existed prior? For instance, cannibalism in a real sense, or and also you're going to have people who are saying, this is obviously representative of imbibing the soma, mushrooms, whatever mind-altering chemical was available.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the kind of shamanic stream, isn't it? The kind of the mushrooms and the
and then you have the other one that's sort of working with the dead, but in a obviously different way than.
Well, that's it. So if you go back far enough, certainly in Egypt, I mean, Egypt is very well. I think it's there. It's obviously there in all cultures, really. Mm-hmm. It's certainly there in ours now, but in Egypt, this idea of eating of human flesh, but also the kind of reframing of that with the famous myth of where Hathor, or Sekhmet in a later version, she basically sort of starts killing the entire human race, because I suppose the gods in the older style myth, they're supposed to to drink blood. That's their thing. They're like kind of vampires in a way. Mm-hmm. That's their primary food and the blood that they eat is taken from cattle, as you would find in certain African cultures now, that people drink blood from cattle. They don't necessarily kill them, but they can somehow they do kill that cattle eventually, but they can tap the blood and live off that. And that's the kind of that's the model by which Egyptian gods, I think, in the older strata, that's how they live. They live on blood. But of course, the cattle that they herd are actually us, human beings. Right. We're referred to as the human cattle. And she says at one stage that she's going to kind of she's going to kill all of the human cattle because she's angry about some affront to her father. Yeah,
the good shepherd.
So she starts doing that, which is, again, it's rather like Kali or something like that. She gets into this, and it's funny, the same thing happens in the temple in India, that the goddess becomes completely intoxicated on blood. Mm-hmm. It should be said, in the blood offerings, I mean, we're not used to this now, but in that temple, at one of the festivals, people offer blood rites, and they kill chickens, really. But if you think 200,000 people turn up, and most of them bring a live chicken as an offering, it means the temple is absolutely swimming with blood by mid-fast. I mean, we completely freak out for most of our aesthetic ways of looking at it. And it's not impossible that the same sort of thing would happen in the Egyptian context. But as you know, in the story, they kind of work out that maybe this isn't a good idea. Got to find some way to distract the goddess, get her out of her blood rage. And they do that by getting her drunk and giving her wine it's a beer rather that so we laugh. There's probably Newcastle Brown. They give her a couple of bottles of Newcastle Brown, which is very like Egyptian beer, and she gets very, very drunk, and she kind of gets into a party mood and she forgets about the idea of killing everybody. So in a sense, that's a myth in which they kind of substitute for blood. They substitute beer in the same way that we might substitute wine for blood. So, but in Egyptian context, it's not wine so much. It's beer is their major ritual drink, really. So there's a very, very old record of how they substituted from the taking of blood to the taking of beer as the substitute was the major offering that they use. So we're already getting further back. But if you look at the cult of almost the pre-dynastic stuff, the stuff that exists before most of the written stuff that you only know about from the archaeology of these sites, and you have this ancient city, one of the largest ancient cities ever found in the ancient world. Actually, is the citadel of Set in Upper Egypt, which is a kind of just a place in the desert now, and it seems likely from. Petrie thought from analysing the graves that there was those pre-dynastic people, those ancient people, were involved in some sort of what you would call ritual cannibalism. That the bodies in the tombs, even though he kind of claimed, he said that they were undisturbed tombs, they hadn't been robbed out or anything when they went into them, that he thought he could find evidence. Certainly it's weird the way the bodies, they're not laid out in a normal way. I mean, when they first discovered this place, Petrie was convinced that it wasn't even an Egyptian site. He said it's so unusual, this place. It cannot possibly be Egyptian. But of course he's wrong about that. It definitely is Egyptian. It's the oldest form. The fact that they'd separated the heads from the other bones in the grave, and there was some indication that maybe they'd eaten some of the flesh or touched some of the flesh. It doesn't mean that they were eating. I mean, this was most ritual cannibalism is not a violent act. It's an act of religious reverence for your ancestors. That's what they say now. With some other there's another circumstance where occasionally it does happen in another way. But on the whole, it's a religious liturgy. So it's quite likely that the oldest religious magical practice really has got something to do with the eating or the tasting of human flesh. And we're talking about stuff that's 4,000 BC, 5,000 BC. It should say that in Egypt, most people wouldn't know there was anything there before then, but because they didn't bother to. They've only just really started researching this stuff, and there are a lot of there's stuff from all periods now that go right back to whatever you call it, the Ice Age. Even in Egypt itself, there's rock art and all the rest, and they all indicate that this idea that we use in modern magic of the Eucharist has an extremely old pedigree. I mean, it's not uncontentious. So, people have other theories of why this is so. So, the magical stuff that we're doing, or say, for instance, the wax image spell as well, is a sense is another, the making of a little creature, a little humanoid mannequin type thing, and sticking pins in it. That's probably one of the oldest magical techniques that's ever existed, and those sort of techniques they're kind of quite primal. I think they come right from the unconscious in some ways, not from the kind of they come from the folk religion, and the folk religion is much older than the stuff that we know about from books, and also it's continuous, it's still practiced. So it's discovering stuff like that. Plus, as well, I suppose you'd say, well, apart from these other trends of the ancestors, what is another very, very old trend in religion, or what is the oldest religion of all? Could well be astronomy itself, just the observation of the night sky, and the oldest exercise in virtual reality that's ever existed. I mean, we're all a bit blasé about this now. We kind of probably ignore it most of the time. But back when there weren't any artificial lights, or not very much anyway. The reality of the sky and the observation of that and the marking of all the patterns, that also must be, that's the origin of, that's one of the oldest magical things, and that is, again, that's something, all those things seem to have come back into magic now. I mean, maybe there was a period, it was there, but it was kind of, it was treated like a metaphor or something. But now all those ideas of the observation of astronomy and the Eucharist magic and the communion with the dead, all those themes in various writers, I think now, over the last few years, is part of the spirit of our age, have kind of realized that those are probably some of the most powerful magical techniques that exist. And, they have their history, and the history is not just into Egypt, but Egypt provides a very big element of that. And in fact, Egypt, as I say, it was acknowledged, even, all the different magical cultures around it always acknowledged that Egypt was the, whatever magic they may have. I think it says in the Torah or something, there's 10 parts of magic and 9 parts of it Egypt's got, and we've got the rest. So we got 10% and they've got 90%, really, or 93% or whatever. Right. So it's acknowledged in the ancient world that they have these secrets that are special, or they have these techniques. And the fact of the matter is we're still using them. We're still using all of those techniques in a modified form. As I say, I think the Thelemic Eucharist is essentially an old form of the. It's a new form, a reframing of the ancient Eucharist, in which they used to have these specially stamped pieces of bread that were sprinkled with blood or whatever, and stamped with the sort of image of a god or goddess that you were trying to get on your side. So it's a continuation. Yeah. I mean, I know some people like to think, we're not like them, but I don't know, it can be so sure, really. The more you look at it, you think, well, actually, we might not have, how we work that out for ourselves, I don't know. Maybe it's just instinctual that these ideas re-emerge given enough time.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, all I do know is I think you articulated that really well in terms of those different streams and how Egypt is the prime example of each of them in many ways. I have basically 2 general other questions.
Oh, let's do that, yeah.
All right. Okay, so the first one is, we've talked a lot about Isis, not so much about Osiris, but
he's there, though. He's
obviously there, but in your book, one of the things you make a point of is mentioning how Isis and Osiris were not there in the way that we know them from the beginning, and in fact, their sort of instantiation, I guess, was the beginnings of a mystery cult, whereas before it didn't quite seem so much.
Right. Well, this is. It's there. I don't want to be too dogmatic about that, but there is this weird fact that that the records of the goddess Isis, that they don't really exist before the pyramid texts. Now that you might say, oh, but they're really, really old. Well, this is a strange thing. Well, of course they're quite, whatever they are, 2,500 BC or something, or 2,200 BC or something, the pyramid texts, depending on what sort of way you look at it. So that's kind of old enough. And they're in that, but there isn't, you say, well, there isn't any other evidence. There isn't any archaeological evidence other than, that's earlier than that. Or not much. There are no. So I don't think there's anything. In fact, in the sense of statues or figurines or whatever, or constructions that seem to be part of that group, part of that text. So in a way, you see the beginning of the cult of Isis and Osiris. Possibly. I mean, they're they are a reframing of older gods and goddesses. I mean, I mentioned already that the form, the two kites, Isis and Nephthys, who appear as two vultures or two raptors at either side of the corpse of Osiris. That idea of the birds, of these birds of prey or these carrion-eating birds, if you obviously that idea of the bird goddess, that is, but nobody knows what that might be called, right? There are other names for it. That people are in some notable, really interesting books, I think. I've tried to connect that with bird images that you find from what is now the border between Syria and Turkey at Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe. I think these ancient kind of what would you call it, Paleolithic or very, very old cities before the Neolithic or whatever. They are settlements. They're not really cities. They're kind of gatherings of people, and they have iconography there on the walls of their houses. They don't seem to have any temples that they found. I know Göbekli Tepe, that people say that's a temple, but in the city itself, all the religion seems to take place in the houses, and there is images of birds, and you've got people who theorize that's an ancient form of the goddess, and that's quite likely. You're never going to be able to. If people say, well, if there's this ancient bird goddess that existed wherever it is, 10,000 BC, and then you've got Isis, she's a bird goddess, they must be the same goddess. But really, that you're not really entitled to make that.
Right.
That leap, it's possible, but she may be not a goddess. She may be a demon. In fact, classical sources say that Isis and Osiris are demons, or who began life as demons, but because of this, you get this in Plutarch, because of their something special about them, special things they do, they stop being demons and they become gods. They manage to raise themselves up. Whereas Seth, who's also a demon, he doesn't mind that. He doesn't manage that leap. So there's an idea that they might be. When I say demons, they might be some sort of specialist. As I say, there's a whole project in Egyptology at the moment to study this class of spirits, which we kind of just call demons without really thinking about it. And there are probably more demons in Egypt than there are gods, really. There are all these entities that you only see once. They might appear and you might just know their name. You don't know much about them. But there are hundreds and maybe thousands of these things. They're just discovering that everybody has ignored for the last 100 years or whatever because they had enough on their plate. So they're a special class of entity within the Egyptian way of looking at the world, within the Egyptian religion. They're not exactly gods in the sense that we think of them. They have special powers and everything, but they're, I don't know, they're kind of smaller in a way, or they have a sort of narrower range of activities that are involved with some specialist thing, maybe only one thing that they do. They might be connected with one particular element or one particular situation, like the birds that appear at the funeral and are waiting to sort of eat things or whatever. So Isis, they may start life as one of those demonic creatures, if you like, one of many thousands of them. And there's a kind of process in terms of Egyptian history itself when it's political, if you like. There's a political reworking of the entire mythology. Somebody comes along and writes it all up into a completely new system, and there are lots of contradictions that appear in that, which is how they know it's all been rewritten. But in a sense, there's an element of propaganda there.
Right.
I don't lay that as a sort of overstate that too much. I mean, it's stated in some academic books as well that people might question what is a true myth? What is the nature of true myth? a myth that's actually true, as opposed to a myth that's been made up, if you like.
What is truth? Right?
What is truth? But it's a question that somebody asked about these myths. Is it a true myth? You see, a true myth is one that you don't know where it comes from, or at least if a myth is so old that you don't know who made it up or where it came from. It's just part of us. It's just organic.
That's a good point.
That's a true myth. But a myth like that's where you know that some person, whether it might be a clever person, sat down and physically wrote it down, made this story up, and you can see it happening, and you can see the mistakes, and you can see all the different books that and things that they might have referred to when they kind of made this construction, and they have a particular thing in mind as they make the myth. They're trying to back up a certain point of view, which of course is the point of view of kingship and of monarchy. The myth of Isis and Osiris, I should say, it is tied up with a political project of powerful people in the ancient world who have constructed a complex society and need a myth to kind of underpin that and to show why there should be such things as kings. 'Cause, I mean, that's the weird thing. Maybe we don't have this in America so much, but that people kind of take for granted the idea that ancient societies had kings and queens. But in fact, it was an innovation. It was probably an innovation of the Egyptian world. You might have had chieftains or clever people or, I don't know, elected collective or whatever.
But they weren't selected by God or whatever.
They didn't have this idea that they're selected by God. I mean, but the European kings say the same thing. Oh, I'm descended from Melusine, or I'm descended from King Arthur or something. People have developed a mythological basis for their existence to justify the existence of huge inequalities, really. And the system works. So yeah, it does. I suppose you could also say the same about lots of other myths. You see them in construction. The more like the Christian myth or whatever, the closer it is to us, the more we can see the scissors and paste job taking place, really. But it doesn't mean that the myth can't take on a life of its own, which is what the other people say. It may not be as old a myth. It may not be the oldest myth, and as I say, you have these other gods like Hathor, and I mean, say Hathor. People would say, "Oh, Hathor is Isis," but Hathor isn't really Isis. Hathor is Hathor, but at some point, Isis kind of takes over everybody else's mythology, and the same with Nuit. She takes over the mythology. Isis takes over the mythology of Nuit. She takes over every goddess. She kind of takes their attributes and makes them into her cult, which is all right. That's the kind of cool thing to do, really. Maybe that is, as a theologian, you would say, well, that's our vision of the divine evolving and changing over time, so that we see the gods differently. Success is your proof. Yeah, and it works for people, and maybe it's of the time, and people don't always relate to these older gods and stuff, or maybe they become irrelevant over time. Or crisis happens, as I say, that's why a lot of the mythology is because something really bad has happened, and the older system has fallen apart and has not worked, so people have reframed the whole thing. So that's all I meant by that, really. But obviously that means I'm also quite interested in... It's important to me to say that the idea of kingship and elites and inequality is not inevitable. History shows that there are alternatives, that people have done different things. And magically, you have the model of kingship, which is obviously really, really important in things like Freemasonry and the OTO, and it has its kings. I don't know if it has queens in the OTO. Do they have queens in the OTO?
Not to my knowledge.
So they just have kings. I mean, that is a bit strange in a way, not to have queens as well. Maybe they get there. But But in a way, the pattern and masonry is this kind of hierarchical structure, like medieval knights and whatever. But incredibly productive way of looking at things. And that's magic is sort of constructed inside, and all the hierarchies of demons, it shadows that. They have their dukes and their kings and all the rest, and you have this pyramidal structure that you're kind of trying to raise yourself up through until you reach the crown, and so the aristocratic imagery of magic is very difficult to get away from.
Yeah.
But you say, well, maybe there's another alternative way of looking at this, which is what was magic. A lot of these magical techniques, that's all I'm doing really, is saying, well, there are these other magical techniques. They have a history that comes before that. Because even though I said that you can't find the archaeological records of Isis and Osiris before the pyramid text, you do find these other gods and goddesses like Horus and Nuit and Hathor and Set and Min and a few other gods as well. So there's kind of older strata of gods who are very interesting, are very relevant. They have things that are very relevant to the practice of magic, I would have thought.
So I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, and I highly recommend your books, and it's very interesting material, so appreciate it. And maybe you could remind people where they could find you and your books online.
Well, they can find the two books were Phi-Neter, Power of the Egyptian Gods, and Isis, Goddess of Egypt and India, and you'll be able to find them on Amazon. But you can find me on Facebook as Mogg Morgan, and you can find me on Twitter as well as Ombos. Ombos being the name of this ancient citadel of Set in as well, Seth the Ombite, of course. So that's my tag on Twitter. So one of those, you should be able to find me through one of those.
Excellent.
Probably Facebook, as I say, or go to the Mandrake website.
Right, and I'll have a link there in the show notes for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I'd like to remind you that although you're able to listen to this podcast at no charge, the costs to produce it are significant. Your financial contributions ensure the continuity of the free podcast. Please support Occult to Personality Podcast by joining the membership section at chamberofreflection.com or via Patreon at patreon.com/occultofpersonality. And if you're already supporting the show or have done so in the past, my heartfelt thanks, and I salute you. Now, in the Chamber of Reflection, the Occult to Personality membership section, there are a couple of new recordings for members. An interview with the publishers of Fraternal Review magazine, discussing their reader-voted list of top Masonic books, as well as a profile of the originator of the Christian Kabbalah, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Join now to receive access and support the show.
Oh,